The runt didn't squeal when the others stepped on him. He only looked up like he was waiting for someone. She was the girl no one noticed. He was the pig no one wanted. And when they walked into the fairground together, people stopped talking. They said he wouldn't live the night. He was the last piglet born that spring and the smallest by far. When the others squirmed and shoved and nursed, he got trampled. He didn't squeal. He just blinked, like he was already used to losing. Elsie stood at the edge of the pen, hands dug into her skirt. She didn't say anything when her father grunted, "Leave him." She just waited until he walked back to the barn, then climbed the fence and knelt beside the runt. He was slick with afterbirth, shaking, and so still she thought he might already be gone. But when she touched his side, he gave the faintest kick. That was enough. She scooped him up and wrapped him in her apron like a broken doll, cradling him against her stomach. He fit so small it looked like she wasn't carrying anything at all. She tucked him behind the stove in the corner of the kitchen where the heat stayed even through the night and whispered, "Just until you stop shaking." Her father didn't ask. He wouldn't have noticed anyway. He hadn't looked her in the eye since her mother died last winter. He just worked the fence, worked the fields, worked until the bones in his hands pushed the skin. Grief had emptied the house, and the only color left was a faded green ribbon sitting by the kitchen window, the one her mother wore in her braid the day she collapsed in the pig yard. The ribbon had snapped when they cut it from her hair. Elsie never touched it again. That night, the piglet didn't cry. He didn't root or claw or try to climb. He just watched her, the same way she had once watched her mother fold laundry without moving. Quiet, still, waiting for something that would never come. She gave him drops of milk from a soap rag and set half a biscuit near his mouth. He licked it once, then turned his face away. She almost put him back outside, but then he blinked again, and his ears twitched like he understood something, like he was seeing her clearer than any of the farmhands ever had. So she stayed beside him. Each day, she tucked him inside her apron and carried him to the back door before her father came in. She smuggled oats from the feed bucket and whispered bedtime stories as he curled into a circle behind the firewood. She named him Button because his eyes looked sewn on and he fit perfectly in her hands. She didn't know what made her keep him. Maybe it was because he was quiet, or because he never looked away when she stared at him, or maybe because she was tired of things dying in silence around her. Weeks passed. The other piglets grew round and loud. Button stayed thin, his legs too short, his spine a narrow line beneath the skin. But he followed her everywhere. When she hung clothes, he sat in the basket. When she scrubbed the porch, he pressed his snout to the board she finished. He never wandered far. Not once. The neighbors called him a joke. One boy said he looked like a sick rat wearing hose. But Button never flinched, never squealed back. He just waited at Elsie's feet, like he knew she was the only one who saw him. One evening, Elsie found him pacing the windowsill, not sniffing, not rooting, just pacing back and forth in front of that green ribbon, the one still curled and faded behind the glass. She hadn't looked at it in months. Not really. But Button stopped and stared at it, then turned to her with those small black eyes like pinholes in paper. He pawed once at the glass, then sat down. The next morning, the ribbon was gone. She found it beside the stove, dragged there like a prize. Button had scratched the windowsill raw, trying to pull it free. She didn't understand why, but she couldn't throw it away. So she tucked it in her apron pocket, just below where Button slept. That night, the wind howled through the fence slats. The pigs squealed in the dark. Her father cursed and ran out with a lantern to check the east pen. Elsie stayed inside with Button, holding him close as thunder rolled far away. But Button didn't flinch at the storm. He only stared at the door, still, waiting. And when Elsie finally whispered, "You can stay," he laid his head against her wrist and didn't move again until morning. The next morning, the yard smelled strange. Elsie didn't know why at first. The sky was clear. The chickens were pecking the dirt like always, and the wind came in slow from the east. But when she stepped onto the porch, Button was already at the bottom step, snout pressed to the ground, frozen like a statue. His tail didn't wag, and his ears twitched once, then stopped. She knelt and tried to pick him up. He wouldn't let her. Instead, he turned his head toward the east fence. That stretch of wood had always been crooked, patched a dozen times, half rotted, more gapped than slat. Her father always meant to fix it. He never did. But today, Button stared at it like something waited on the other side. She carried him past it anyway, holding him tight as he squirmed in her arms. The moment they were close, Button squealed, loud, a sound she'd never heard from him. Not pain, not hunger, fear. He kicked and jerked until she nearly dropped him. So she stepped back, confused, and the squealing stopped. Just like that. Later that day, the neighbor came riding fast, dirt fly behind his boots. One of his piglets had vanished in the night, gone clean from the pen. Fox or worse, he said, chewing the side of his lip. Fence lines not holding. Elsie looked toward the east slats and saw it then. The boards had been pulled back, not broken. Pulled, like something smart had opened them. She didn't say anything. But that night, when her father lit the lantern and checked the pens, Button followed him to the fence and stood still, staring at the gap like he was waiting for something to come back. Her father laughed. "What's that thing, no?" Elsie didn't laugh. She brought Button inside and held him close until he slept. The next day, she tried to walk him by the fence again. He dug in his heels. Refused. She took the long way around. She told herself it was a coincidence, just a nervous pig. But every time she passed the east edge of the property, Button went stiff. His ears lowered. His legs locked. That week, her father started talking about the fair. They needed money and bad. That boy's got a sow going up. Full weight. Could win $50. He looked at Button then and shook his head. That one's not worth the straw he sleeps in. Elsie said nothing. But that night, she tied the green ribbon around Button's neck like a medal. It looked too big. It kept sliding off. So she wrapped again and tucked it beneath his chin. Button didn't squirm. He laid his head on her foot, like he always did. 3 days later, they went into town. The general store had a post in the window. County Fair, 2 weeks. Pigs. Cattle. Best in show. Her father slapped a coin on the counter and told the clerk, "Enter her." "For what?" He shrugged. "Curiosity. Let folks see what mistake looks like." Button stood by her feet, rope leash dragging in the dust. The clerk raised an eyebrow, but wrote the name anyway. Runty's side pan. The town boys gathered on the porch as they left. One pointed. "That the rat pig?" Another whistled. "You gonna wear a dress to the fair, Elsie? Maybe he could be your date." She didn't answer, but Button stopped walking. He turned his head slowly, stared at the boys, didn't blink, didn't look away, and the boys stopped laughing. That night at home, she took the ribbon from his neck and laid it by the window again. Button stared at it, nose twitching. Then he padded over to the stove and began digging in the dirt beside the hearth. At first, she thought he was cold, but he wasn't looking for warmth. He was digging for something. Scratch, sniff, pause. Over and over. He pulled out an old nail, a scrap of fabric, then a corner of black wood, scorched and sharp. She remembered it. It came from the fire that burned their mother's bench, the one her father threw out the day after the funeral. Button sniffed it, then buried it again with his snout. Elsie watched, heart tight in her chest. The next morning, she walked past the fence. Button followed, until they reached the east corner. There he stopped. He didn't squeal this time. He just sat and stared. Elsie stared too, because now the slats weren't just pulled. They were gone, and in the soft earth beneath the post, something had scratched a circle. Not an animal. Too even, like someone or something, had marked that ground on purpose. She looked down at Button. He looked up at her. And in that moment, she felt it for the first time. He wasn't following her. He was watching over her. The wagon creaked over the rocks as the fairgrounds came into view, rows of white tents flapping the wind like ghost flags. Elsie sat on the edge of the cart, holding Button in her lap. He was nearly double the size he'd been when she first wrapped him her apron, but still smaller than any pig around. His legs dangled, his snout twitched, and his body was stiff as a branch. They had to cross the narrow creek at the edge of town, just before the fair entrance. It wasn't deep, barely enough water to soak the wheels, but the moment they neared the crossing, Button squirmed. At first, she thought he was just uncomfortable, but then he gave a sharp squeal and clawed at her arm. "Easy," she whispered, tightening her grip. But Button twisted harder, trying to get away, as though the shallow water ahead was fire. Her father grunted from the seat. "Let him down. If he's going to make a scene, better he does it on his own 4 legs." She hesitated. The cart rolled forward. Button let out a cry so sharp and sudden it made a dog bark from a nearby porch. Her father flinched. "Put him down now." So she did. Button landed with a soft thump on the dirt road, then bolted, not back toward the farm, not sideways toward town. He ran toward a crooked post by the side of the creek, covered in vines. "Button!" She jumped down and followed, heart pounding. He wasn't running wild. He stopped at the post, stared at it. His legs shook, but he wouldn't move away. When she reached him, he pressed his body against her leg and whimpered low in his throat. The post wasn't part of a fence. It stood alone. Moss covered most of it, and an old iron bolt rusted through its side. Near the base, Elsie saw something carved faintly into the wood. Half-faded letters, burned deep long ago. For Ma, may she never see this place. She swallowed hard. "Elsie!" her father shouted from the cart. "Get that animal and come on. We'll be late." She knelt down and tried to coax Button toward the wagon. He didn't budge. So she picked him up, holding him tight against her chest, and walked across the bridge without looking back. She didn't say a word. The fairgrounds buzzed like a hive. Farmers shouting, children crying, steam rising from roasted corn. Pens full of hogs and goats lined the main field, and judges with ribbons walked between rows. They were assigned a stall at the far end of the novelty section, beside a chicken that could play a toy piano and a goat that jumped rope. Button didn't make a sound. He just curled up in the straw and stared at the wall. A woman with a clipboard stopped by and looked him over. "This one yours?" Elsie nodded. "Not standard. Too small for market class. You're signed up for novelty exhibition. If he does something interesting, maybe the crowd votes." "Votes for what?" The woman shrugged. "Best curiosity. $10 prize." Elsie lowered her eyes. "He's not a joke." The woman smiled politely, already walking away. Button didn't stir. She sat beside him in the stall, knees pulled to her chest, and watched the sun sink lower. That evening, lightning rolled in from the west. A storm had been brewing all day, and now thunder shook the tents like God pounding on the sky. Exhibitors rushed to cover their animals. Rain turned the dirt to soup. Wind tore a poster from the fair tent wall and plastered it across their stall gate. "State's best, the champion hog." A thick, snorting pig stared proudly from the image, gold ribbon in its mouth. Elsie looked at Button. He looked at the poster, then turned away. When the rain stopped, she saw something odd. Button's pen was dry. The stall beside them flooded. Water pooled under the ropes, soaked the hay. But Button's straw was untouched. He hadn't moved from his spot, but the earth beneath him stayed dry like it had been protected, or warned. Just before dawn, she dozed off beside him. When she woke, the gate was open, and Button was gone. She ran barefoot to the rows of pens. Hair soaked from dew. Chickens squawked. A boy pointed toward the judging platform. There, under the wooden steps, lay Button, curled, calm, dry as if the storm hadn't happened. She knelt beside him. He opened one eye and touched his snout to her wrist. Something was under him, a scrap of paper or cloth. She pulled it free. It was a torn fair flyer, the same one that had blown into his stall. But someone had drawn a circle around the date. Today. She looked at Button again. He blinked once and waited. The sky was still gray when the fair resumed, but people came anyway. Boots squelched in the wet grass, and the smell of fried dough mixed with damp hay. By mid-morning, the judges began lining up the animals for the novelty trials. Goats on skateboards, a dog that bowed, a goose wearing a bonnet. People laughed and clapped politely. Elsie didn't move. She held Button in her arms, his body warm and steady against her chest. When they called her name, she stood. A boy near the rope whispered, "She's really going to try it?" Another laughed. "He's not even funny." The judge pointed to the starting line, a row of barrels and hay bales shaped into a maze. At the end, a blue ribbon clipped to a post, just like every year. Obstacle trial. Show us something or the crowd moves on. She set Button down. He didn't move. The judge cleared his throat. "Begin." Button stood still, not afraid, not frozen, waiting. The judge looked annoyed. "Is this it?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone chuckled. Then a loud crash. A mule 2 pens down reared up and kicked over a barrel. It rolled across the field and thudded into a stack of crates. When the fair hands rushed to lift the barrel, someone shouted, "Hold on, what's that?" A dead gopher lay under it, bloated, blood at the mouth. One of the workers swore. Poison. If that mule hadn't kicked. Everyone turned back to Button, still standing, still watching. The crowd went quiet. The judge stepped forward, clearing his throat again. "All right then, let's see what he's got." Elsie whispered, "Go on, Button." He took one step, then another. Carefully, slowly, he walked toward the first hay bale and nudged it. It wobbled. He stepped back, circled, then hopped over it in a tiny leap, hooves barely clearing the straw. Gasps. He approached the second obstacle, a hanging ribbon meant to mimic a curtain. He sniffed it, ducked beneath, then shook his head and sneezed. A child clapped. At the halfway point, a boy tossed a candy apple on the ground to tease him. Button stopped, sniffed, looked back at Elsie, and kept walking. "No bribes, someone said, laughing. By the end, he stood beneath the blue ribbon, nose high, waiting. The judge blinked uncertain. Elsie walked up slowly and tied the ribbon around Button's neck. The crowd applauded, not loudly, but real. A reporter scribbled notes. A woman with a little girl wiped her eyes. "That pig," she whispered, "acts like he's seen things." Later that afternoon, when the tents were thinning out and the sun was coming through patches of cloud, Elsie sat on a crate beside Button's pen. The green ribbon, her mother's, hung from a post above him. She'd tied it there that morning for luck. Button was curled in the hay, nose twitching in sleep. A man approached, a stranger in dark boots and a fair hen's vest. He reached toward the food basket beside her. Before he could touch it, Button was up, fast. He lunged at the man's wrist with a sharp squeal. His teeth snapped just an inch from skin. The man backed off, hand raised. "What the hell?" Elsie stood between them. "That's ours." The man narrowed his eyes and walked off. The judge from earlier came by an hour later, holding a clipboard. "That pig still got energy?" She nodded. "We're reopening Best in Show. Public vote. No weight class. Just heart." He glanced at Button. "Tell you what, bring him to the main arena at dusk. Let's see what the people say." That evening, she washed Button in a tin tub behind the stables. The water turned gray fast. He stood still the whole time. When she pulled him out, she found the green ribbon in the water, floating in circles. But it wasn't torn anymore. It was whole. She hadn't fixed it. She dried it gently and tied it again, this time around her own wrist. As the sun lowered and lanterns lit across the fair, She carried Button toward the main arena. On the way, a small girl knelt to pet him. Button paused and nuzzled her hand. The girl giggled. "He's soft." Her mother smiled at Elsie. "You raise him." Elsie nodded. The woman said softly, "He walks like he knows the ground." The arena was lit by strings of yellow bulbs. Families lined the benches. The announcer called for the novelty winners to enter. One by one, animals were led across the field. Some danced, some barked, some strutted. Button walked calmly to the center and sat. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. He just looked up at the crowd, eyes shining like wet buttons. And the people stared. For once, they didn't laugh. A silence hung in the air. Then came a single clap, then another, then a wave of them. By the time they left, the judge handed Elsie a slip of paper. "You're in the finals." She tucked it into her apron pocket. Button leaned his head against her knee. That night, in their little tent by the edge of the fairgrounds, Elsie curled beside him in the straw. She tied the green ribbon to his rope leash. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind stirred the paper flaps. Something passed by the tent. She heard it pause, but it didn't come in. Button's eyes stayed closed. He didn't even lift his head. He wasn't guarding anymore. He was resting. The fairgrounds were dry by morning, but the air still held the weight of yesterday's storm. Mud had crusted on the edges of the walkways, and the smell of trampled hay and roasted peanuts clung to everything. But none of that mattered. Today was the final judging. Elsie woke early, buttoned her cleanest dress, and sat cross-legged in the tent brushing mud out of Button's ears. He lay still, eyes closed, as though saving energy for something he already knew was coming. When she gently tied the now clean green ribbon around her wrist, Button opened his eyes and gave a short grunt. She smiled. "You ready?" she whispered. He didn't blink, just stood up, shook off the straw, and walked out ahead of her. In the main ring, rows of bleachers filled slowly. This wasn't just a novelty contest. This was best in show. Farmers lined the railings with their finest animals. Sleek hogs, glossy cows, a prize bull that looked like it had been carved from granite. And then there was Button, half the size of the next smallest pig, with short legs and a scar behind one ear where a rooster had once pecked him. But when he stepped into the ring, heads turned. It wasn't what he looked like. It was the way he walked. Slow, deliberate, like each hoof step was a choice. Like he wasn't there to win. He was there to finish something. The judge raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, your finalists." One by one, the animals were paraded across the field. Trained handlers nudged them with sticks, whispered cues, tapped hooves to make them pose just right. When it was Elsie's turn, she didn't move. She simply clicked her tongue once. Button walked forward. He didn't need nudging. He didn't hesitate. He walked right to the center and turned to face the crowd on his own. Then he sat. Silence. Some people laughed, quietly, awkwardly, unsure if it was part of a trick. Others leaned in. One of the older judges said, "He's small, but focused." A boy in the front row said, "That pig knows something." Just then, Button stood back up, walked 3 steps, and stopped beside a nearby hay bale. He sniffed, then dug a single hoof into the dirt. A moment later, he nosed the edge of the bale and shoved it over. Gasps. Underneath lay a length of red-stained rope, knotted at one end. The same type of rope that had gone missing from the back of Farmer Dale's cart 2 nights ago. The same cart that had a prize lamb vanish from it. The sheriff stood slowly. No one moved. Button walked back to the center of the ring and lay down, like he was done, like the show was over. A man near the fence whispered, "That pig's not performing." He's pointing. The judge stepped down into the dirt and walked to Elsie. "Did you know he'd do that?" She shook her head. "He just does what he wants." The man looked down at Button, who blinked slowly. "Smartest animal I've ever seen." He turned to crowd. "Blue ribbon," he said, "holding high, goes to the pig with purpose." Elsie walked to Button and knelt beside him. She tied the blue ribbon around his neck, like a medal, soft and careful. No one clapped. They just stood, watching, until a small girl in the crowd started clapping on her own. Then another. Then her mother joined. And suddenly the ring filled with sound. Not raucous, not wild, just real. As they left the ring, people stepped out of the way. Not just for Elsie, but for Button. One man muttered, "A pig like that? That's a legend waiting to happen." Another said, "He's got eyes like he's lived twice." Back at the stall, Elsie gave him half a fried biscuit. Button sniffed it, then nudged it toward her instead. She laughed, tired and proud. That night, as the sun sank low behind the tents and the sky turned orange, they sat together in the straw. Button leaned against her leg, and she brushed dirt from his side. A boy passed by the stall, looked in, and said, "Ain't no pig." Elsie looked up. "What then?" He shrugged. "Something else." He kept walking. The wind stirred the torn edge of the fair poster tacked above their pen. It flapped once, showing the old slogan, "Biggest wins." Below it, someone had scribbled in pencil, "Sometimes smallest knows." Elsie didn't touch it. She just reached down and stroked Button's ear. And for the first time, he purred like a cat. Not loud, just enough for her to hear. The fair was over by dawn. Tents folded, banners rolled, wagons creaked under crates and hay, pulling back toward the edge of town. By midday, the fairgrounds looked like a field that had only dreamed of being more. Pressed grass, trampled dirt, and scraps of colored paper blowing in the breeze. Elsie sat in the wagon bed with Button in her lap, blue ribbon still tied around his neck. He was quiet, not sleepy, just still, like he knew his part was finished. The sun caught his ears, turning the fuzz golden. She rested her chin on his back and didn't speak all the way home. Her father said little when they arrived. He glanced at the ribbon, nodded once, and walked to the barn. No congratulations, no questions, just silence. The same kind of silence he'd been drowning in since the winter her mother died. Elsie carried Button inside the house like a prince. She passed the kitchen table, where her mother used to braid her hair and hum while the bread cooled. She passed the window where the green ribbon had once sat untouched, cracked and curling. It wasn't there anymore. She didn't remember taking it down. But she saw it again, now pinned neatly beside the hearth, straight and whole, tacked under the edge of her mother's old picture frame. Her mother's face in the photograph looked tired but kind, half smiling the way she did when she caught Elsie watching her in the garden. And now beside it hung the ribbon, clean, pressed. Below the frame sat the food basket Button had defended at the fair. Inside it, the same blue ribbon he'd won, folded into a loop and resting beside a small tag labeled Curiosity, first place. Her father must have placed it there. He hadn't said anything, but he'd framed it. That night, Button slept not in his crate, not behind the stove, but in a small wooden pen her father had built outside the porch. The rails sanded smooth, the gate facing the front door. No latch, no chain, just open space. The next morning, Elsie found her father hammering a post into the ground. On top of it, he hung a little wooden sign. Button! No more, no less. She watched him from the doorway. He didn't look up, but when he finished, he turned around, brushed his hands, and walked back toward the barn. 2 days later, children from town came walking up the road. A small group, dusty knees, grass-stained fingers, wide eyes. "Is this where the pig lives?" one boy asked. Elsie nodded. "He's resting." Another girl peeked over the fence and whispered, "Did he really find the rope?" Elsie didn't answer. Button lifted his head and blinked. They gasped. One of the boys reached his hand through the fence. Button didn't flinch. He let them scratch behind his ears. But when Elsie stood, he got up and followed her. Slowly, step for step, always watching. The sheriff came by that evening with a newspaper. He handed it to her father, but spoke to her. Front page. The headline read, Runty Pig wins hearts and solves a mystery. The sheriff gave a small nod, then looked down at Button. I've seen dogs track blood, horses smell fire, but I never seen an animal just know. Not like him. He tipped his hat and left. Her father stood at the door, newspaper in hand, eyes on the photo. It was Button, standing in the arena, not with the ribbon, just standing, still, proud, centered, like he'd been there before. That night, Elsie walked out to the edge of the fence with Button at her side, the same path where he'd once stopped short, digging in his hooves and squealing at something only he could see. But tonight, he walked calmly beside her. The east corner of the fence, the one with the rotted slats, had been replaced. New wood, fresh nails, no claw marks, no gaps, just solid quiet. She stood there for a long time, staring into the trees. Button sat at her feet. The wind blew softly through the grass. The moon rose full behind the barn, and for a moment, it felt like someone else was watching with them. Someone who understood things they couldn't say. Someone whose ribbon still fluttered faintly in the kitchen window. She turned to Button. He looked up at her. She smiled. "You're not just a pig." He grunted. She laughed, then picked him up in her arms, heavier than before, but still light enough to carry, and stepped back inside. On the wall by the door, her father had hung a new frame. Inside it, a photo from the fair. Elsie holding Button, crowd behind them, ribbon around his neck, and underneath, carved into the frame by hand, smallest on the farm, largest in our hearts. Button blinked once, then curled beside the hearth and closed his eyes. The fire crackled. The green ribbon danced in the warm air, lit gold by the flame. And for the first time in months, the house no longer felt quiet. It felt whole,